I drew up the document myself, and I thought I understood what it was. It was a legal instrument, 7 pages, signed and witnessed, governing the disposition of a modest country estate in the north of Lincolnshire, and the modest inheritance of one Elspeth Carow, widow, formerly of a lesser branch of the Carow family of Somerset. My name is Caspar Vane. I have been a solicitor for 31 years and the Duke of Dunravell's closest friend for 26 of them, and I have drafted agreements of every conceivable shape. The document I prepared in the autumn of that year seemed simple enough. Mrs. Carow's late husband, a Mr. Gerald Carow, had died indebted to Dunravell estate in a sum that he had managed, in his final weeks, to settle not in coin, but in the form of a provision. His young widow was to reside at Dunravell House for a period of no fewer than 12 calendar months. In exchange, the debt was cleared, and she retained the last remnant of her own small fortune, a sum sufficient to keep her in rooms in Bath and, with careful management, live quietly for the rest of her days. I thought I understood what it was. I was wrong. The Duke, Everard Ashby, 8th holder of the title, received my summary of the arrangement with the expression he reserved for paperwork that annoyed him. A slight compression about the mouth, a single lowered brow. "She is to live here," he said, "at the house. In the east wing, your grace. She will require a sitting room and a bedchamber. She will take her meals with the household. The arrangement is 12 months, beginning the 1st of November. Gerald Carow's widow." He set the document down. "I never met the man. He borrowed against some corn futures, did he not?" "He did, and lost them, as you'll recall. But she had no part in that. She married him young, and he left her very little." "She is to come here," Everard said again, as though he could not quite resolve the logic of it, "and reside under my roof for a calendar year, and in return I write off a dead man's debt. It clears the estate's books cleanly, and your grace, she has nowhere else to go. The alternative is that a woman of some education and considerable dignity finds herself entirely without resource." He looked at me for a moment. "Is she young?" "She is 32. "Hardly young." "Hardly ancient," I said. He did not argue the point. He signed the agreement and handed it back across the desk, and I had every reason to believe that in his mind the matter was already filed under minor administrative inconveniences and set aside. I was wrong about that, too. I thought that would be the last time the matter crossed his mind in any personal sense. Everard Ashby was a careful man, and since the death of his first wife some 6 years prior, sealed. Not unkind, precisely, but contained, the way a house is contained when the fires are left unlit and the shutters drawn against the season. He ran the estate with discipline. He managed his responsibilities with something approaching ferocity. He did not allow himself sentiment, and he did not allow others close enough to offer it to him. I was perhaps the single exception, and even I kept a respectful distance from the wound at the center of him. The wound was not apparent on the surface. It expressed itself only in certain absences. The portrait in the long gallery he had not walked past in 6 years, the rose garden his late wife had planted that was still tended but never visited, the particular quality of quiet that settled over Dunravell in the evenings, as though the house itself had learned not to make demands. Elspeth Carow arrived on the 3rd of November, in a hired coach that had suffered through the rain, carrying 2 trunks and a small case of books she held on her lap in the carriage rather than trust to the roof box. I know this because I was there to receive her. Everard, occupied with correspondence, had sent word that I should see to the arrival. She stepped out of the coach into the gray November light of the northern coast and looked up at Dunravell House with an expression I found impossible to read. It was not intimidation. It was not relief, precisely. It was the face of a woman who had assessed her situation thoroughly in private and arrived at the only rational response to it, composure. "Mr. Vane," she said when I introduced myself. "You wrote the agreement." "I did, Mrs. Carow. I hope the journey was not too arduous." "It was exactly as arduous as a long journey in the rain should be," she said, quite pleasantly. "I do not suppose there is tea." There was tea. I saw to it myself in the blue sitting room off the east corridor, and she drank it without complaint while I walked her through the household arrangements, her rooms, the dining schedule, the library's hours, and the understanding that she was welcome to use it. She asked 3 precise questions about the terms of the agreement. She had read it, which I had not expected, and had clearly read it carefully, and 2 questions about the library. She thanked me, set down her cup, and said she supposed she ought to unpack before it grew dark. I left her to it. Everard did not appear that evening. He dined alone in his study, as was his habit, and I rather thought he intended to conduct the entire 12 months in that manner. He did not. The first collision came 6 days into November in the library, which they both used before breakfast, a habit neither of them, I understood later, had known the other kept. Elspeth rose early, apparently, and had got into the custom of reading for an hour before the household stirred. Everard had done the same for years. I was not there, but he described it to me with some irritation, and she described it to me with a careful absence of any expression at all, which I have since come to recognize as her variety of amusement. He had found her at his customary chair, not through any malice, simply through having arrived first and found it placed nearest the fire. He had asked, I am told, whether she was aware that the chair in question was the chair most senior to the room. She had said, looking up from her book, that furniture did not generally hold rank to her knowledge, but that she was happy to be corrected on the point. He had said that he was the Duke of Dunravell, and the chair was his. She had stood quite calmly, moved to the adjacent chair, and returned to reading without further comment. He told me this as though it were a complaint. I told him I was not sure what the complaint was exactly, and he looked out the window for a moment, and then said he did not know either. I noted in my private accounting that he had chosen to tell me at all. December came cold and fast. I was in residence through the month, tending to estate business, and so I had the uncommon pleasure of watching something happen that I do not think either of its participants noticed was happening. They argued about everything. Not in the way of enemies. There was no heat to it, no cruelty, no attempt to wound. They argued the way two people argue when they are both accustomed to thinking alone and have suddenly, unexpectedly, encountered a mind worth resisting. She had views about drainage management, derived from having grown up on a Somerset property and watched it fall into ruin through neglect. He had views about grain prices that she found strategically short-sighted. She thought the estate's tenants in the northern field were underhoused. He had been intending to rebuild the cottages in spring and had not mentioned it to anyone. She told him he ought to mention it, since the tenants in question presumably had opinions about their own housing. He told her that running an estate of several thousand acres did not benefit from the opinions of its tenants at every step. She said that perhaps that was why the previous drainage scheme had cost twice what it should have. I watched him realize, over the course of that exchange at dinner one evening, that he could not find the flaw in her argument. It was a peculiar thing to observe in a man of his particular variety of pride, a sort of stillness, and then a movement of the jaw that was not quite a smile but might, in another man, have been one. He did not capitulate, but he sent for the drainage records the following morning. January was bitter on the northern coast. There was snow, and then more snow, and Dunravell was cut off for a week in the middle of the month. During that week I noticed, I confess I watched rather closely by then, that Elspeth Caro had ceased to take her meals separately from the Duke, and had simply begun appearing at the dining table as though she had always intended to. And he, who had for the first month made some effort to arrange his own schedule so that they need not coincide, had ceased making that effort. They spoke over dinner about the history of the estate. She had been reading the old accounts. She had her way into the library in earnest by then, and she had found, she said, a record of the original land grant that contradicted the account in the history of the county he had apparently relied upon for years. He said he doubted it. She produced the document the following evening across the soup. He examined it in silence for a long moment and said it did in fact contradict the county history. She said yes, she knew. He said she might have mentioned it sooner. She said she had only found it that afternoon. After dinner, he stayed at the table 20 minutes longer than he usually did. I pretended not to notice. February brought a brief thaw that turned the walled garden into cold mud, and then a second frost that glazed it silver. I once came upon Elspeth there in the early morning, crouching to examine some root she had uncovered where the kitchen garden met the rose beds, a bulb of some kind, still alive beneath the ice. She looked up when she heard my step and said without preamble that the roses on the south wall were going to need attention in spring. The root stock was old, and several of the canes were splitting. I said I was not certain that fell within the scope of the agreement. She said no, it did not, but that the roses were going to split regardless of what the agreement said, and someone ought to care. There was something in the way she said it, not drama, not sentiment, simply the flat acknowledgement that a thing worth tending ought to be tended, even when tending it was nobody's obligation. I mentioned this to Everard. He was in the estate office at the time, reviewing maps of the moorland parcel to the north. He did not look up, but the following week, the head gardener received new instructions about the south wall roses. It was in February that I first allowed myself to think the word I had been carefully not thinking. She had taken to walking in the walled garden in the mornings despite the cold. Her constitution, she explained to me once, required movement before the day had settled upon her. The garden in February was largely sticks and gray-brown earth, the rose canes cut back to thorns, the paths running with the cold seepage of snowmelt. It was not a garden one would choose to walk in for pleasure. And yet one morning, returning from a meeting in the village, I rounded the east wall and found Everard Ashby walking there. With her, not beside her precisely. They were some yards apart along the same path, and they were not looking at each other. She was speaking, and he was listening, his hands clasped behind him in the posture he adopted when something commanded his full attention. She was describing a revised drainage scheme she had worked out using the estate records, holding a small sketch on a piece of paper. He was looking at the paper. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. I made some sound, the gate, perhaps, and they both looked at me, quite naturally, as though they had not realized they were standing close enough for the sleeves of their coats to nearly touch. I completed my errand and returned to the house, and I allowed myself the word, attachment. I do not think either of them would have used it yet. Everard had been sealed for 6 years, and the habit of sealing is not a thing that opens in a moment, even when something extraordinary applies consistent and patient pressure to the lock. Elspeth, for her part, had her own mode of protection, not coldness but precision. She did not let herself hope where hope had not yet been earned. She was a woman who had learned, I suspected, the cost of hoping too early. But the attachment was there. I saw it in the way he listened to her, not the listening of a man being polite to a social obligation, but the listening of a man who finds the voice of the speaker the most interesting sound in the room. I saw it in the way she argued with him, genuinely contesting, which is a thing one only does with someone whose good opinion one is confident of. I saw it in the small, careful distances they kept, which are not the distances of indifference but the distances of awareness. March came. The drainage scheme was approved, her version of it, though Everard presented it at the county meeting with one modification about the eastern culvert that she had originally proposed. He did not admit this directly to her. He told me. She told me she had read the county meeting minutes. Neither of them mentioned it at dinner. But she passed the salt in his direction before he asked for it, and he thanked her with a degree of deliberateness that was entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not know either of them well. April, the estate work pressed on, and Elspeth acquired the habit of appearing in the estate office with questions, always framed as curiosity, never as interference, that invariably surfaced a problem he had been circling and had not yet solved. The matter of the mill lease, the succession of the Pharaoh tenancy, the question of whether Dunravell should purchase the adjacent moorland before the railway survey arrived in that part of the county. She did not tell him what to do. She asked the right question always and left him to follow it. I will tell you what I noticed most about her manner with him, which was unlike the manner of anyone else at Dunravell. She did not accommodate him, not in the way a guest accommodates a host, and not in the softer and more pernicious way that people sometimes accommodate the powerful, shifting their own positions, narrowing their own opinions, making themselves easier and smaller so as not to cause difficulty. She was not easy or small. When he was wrong, she said so, with that particular economy of hers, direct, without spectacle, and with an implicit confidence that a man worth arguing with would prefer the truth to the comfort of an unchallenged error. He was worth arguing with. I think she had known that from the morning in the library, when he had told her the chair was his. She trusted his intelligence. It was perhaps the most singular gift she could have offered him, because it was the thing he had least expected from the arrangement. I once told him, in late April, over a glass of his particularly good claret, that I had rarely seen the estate's affairs managed so acutely. He said that he had been managing the estate for many years without comment. I said yes, but that this year the decisions had been unusually sound. He gave me a look that communicated with admirable economy that I should return to my claret. May came in with a long blue sky and the smell of the moorland thawing after the winter, and I noted that the walled garden was now tended with a particular care. The south wall roses had been cut back properly and were already putting out their first cautious shoots, dark red against the old stone. I saw Elspeth there one afternoon with the head gardener, pointing to the new growth with an expression that was not precisely joy, but was adjacent to it, the particular satisfaction of a thing that was going to be all right. I saw Everard watching her from the long window of the estate office. He turned away when he noticed me in the corridor. I did not mention it. There was an evening in May. I was leaving for a week in London, returning some documents to a client there, when I said goodbye to both of them after dinner. She shook my hand with her customary directness. He walked me to the door, which he did not always do, and when I turned to say my farewells, he was looking back toward the dining room with the door still open, and the candlelight coming through, and his expression was the expression of a man who has remembered something he had believed himself capable of forgetting, and finds that he was wrong. I completed my business in London in somewhat less than the week I had planned and returned to Dunravell 4 days early. I told myself it was the weather. Summer came to the northern coast, pale and cool, the sea visible from the upper windows in a stripe of gray-blue light. In June, I found Everard on the cliff path above the cove as the sun was going down, sitting on the stone wall that looked out to sea. She was not with him. I sat beside him without invitation, as I have always done, and he said nothing for some time. Then she goes to Bath in November. She does, I said. The year concludes on the 1st of November. That is what the document specifies. He said nothing further. I said nothing further. The sea was the gray-blue of old silk, and the light was going. I thought about that conversation throughout July and August. I thought about the dinners that had become, without any deliberate arrangement, conversations that ran long past the candles burning low. I thought about the library, where I had more than once found both of them reading in the adjacent chairs with the fireplace between them, in the particular comfortable silence that requires considerable trust to maintain. I thought about the evening in July when a riding accident had left one of the grooms badly hurt, and Elspeth had organized the household response with a calm efficiency that had plainly startled Everard. She had sent for the physician, directed the groom's care, managed the distressed staff with such steady competence that by the time Everard arrived from the far field, she had already done everything necessary. He had stood in the corridor and looked at her for a long moment in a way I recognized, because I have known him long enough to have seen that look only once before. September, October, she began quietly to pack. I noticed it before she would have wanted anyone to notice it. That was the thing about Elspeth Caro. She managed things carefully, and she managed her own feelings most carefully of all, with the precision of a woman who has learned that the alternative is to be managed by them instead. She did not allow herself to dwell visibly on the departure. She simply began, at the edges, to prepare for it. A small efficiency every few days that pointed in one direction. The household noticed. Mrs. Oakes told me that the kitchen girl had cried, which had surprised everyone, including the kitchen girl. The head gardener had taken to appearing in the walled garden more frequently than his duties required, finding small tasks near the south wall roses. The footman Thomas, who was 17 and had first arrived at Dunravell 2 months after Elspeth, had been observed doing his duties more slowly in the east corridor, as though extending the time available. She noticed, too. She thanked each of them in the small, direct way that was entirely characteristic of her, not effusively, not with performance, but with the attention of a woman who has seen each person clearly and wants them to know it. It was, I thought, precisely the quality that Dunravell had been missing for 6 years, without knowing it had been missing it. Not with any drama, that was not her manner. A book moved back into the case. A shawl folded. The small alterations of a woman preparing an orderly departure from a place she had not intended to love and had, nevertheless, loved. I saw the shawl one afternoon in early October. I saw the survey she made of the sitting room with her gray eyes, methodical and contained, and I understood what I was looking at. I went to Everard. He was at his desk with 3 ledgers open and a pen in his hand that he had clearly not used recently, because the nib had dried and he had not noticed. I sat down across from him without ceremony. "She is packing," I said. He did not look up. The agreement concludes on the 1st of November. I know what the agreement says. I wrote it. He set the pen down. He looked at me. "Caspar," he said, in the voice he uses when he is about to say something that costs him. "I am aware of the situation. Are you aware that she will leave if you say nothing? The agreement is concluded. She is free to leave. She has her own life. She has lodging she has not seen and a city where she knows no one," I said. "What she has here is a library, a garden, a set of conversations that I would wager are the best either of you has had in years, and the clearest head I have ever seen applied to the affairs of this estate. And she has been here 11 months and 3 weeks, and I am watching both of you be very careful and very foolish." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at the dry pen. "I do not," he said carefully, "wish to give her the impression that she is bound to anything. She is not bound to anything. That is rather the point. In a week she will be free, and she will pack those trunks, and she will take a hired coach south, and you will sit at this desk and look at dried pens for the next several years." I stood. "I have known you a very long time, Everard. Do not be too dignified to use the time that remains." He said nothing. I left him to it. The 31st of October, the last night. She had arranged for her trunks to be brought down the following morning. She had written a brief, courteous letter of thanks to Mrs. Oakes, whom she had come to be genuinely fond of. She had walked the walled garden one final time in the afternoon, and I had watched her from the upper corridor window, standing very still beside the rose canes, which were bare now, it being late autumn, with her hands in the pockets of her gray coat, and her face turned slightly away from the house, though not quite turned away. The south wall roses had been tended. She had seen to that in spring. I did not sleep well. I rose before first light and went down to the kitchen for something warm, and as I came back up the main stair I heard them. Not arguing. Not the measured, animated exchanges I had been witness to for nearly 12 months. They were speaking quietly. Everard's voice was low, and even in the way it becomes when he is controlling something not accustomed to being controlled. She had been coming down for an early start. She had meant to slip away before the household stirred and spare everyone a formal departure. He had heard her on the stair. He had apparently also not slept. I did not intrude. I stood at the bottom of the main stair out of sight in the gray pre-dawn of the 1st of November, and I heard the end of it. "The agreement is concluded," she said. Her voice was quiet and quite steady. "I am free to go." "You are," he said. "And you are free to say nothing." A silence, long enough that I counted it. "I could say nothing," he said. "I have been saying nothing for 11 months, and I believe I have managed it creditably." She said, and I could hear in her voice the thing she almost never allowed to show in it, a fragility at the edges, quickly steadied. "Then perhaps this is the appropriate moment to continue in that manner." "It is not." Another silence. "Elspeth," he said her name once without any embellishment, and that single word was the most unguarded thing I had heard from him in 6 years. "I did not engage this arrangement with any expectation. I want you to know that. I expected an inconvenience. I expected a quiet, civilized year, and I expected to return to my habits without alteration. And I am standing here at 5 o'clock in the morning because I cannot, in conscience, allow you to get into a hired coach without telling you that I have been wrong about nearly every expectation I have ever applied to you." The silence this time was hers. "The agreement binds you to nothing," he continued. "I am aware of that. I am not asking for anything the agreement can compel. I am asking, and I recognize this is not a thing I have had occasion to practice, I am asking you to stay. Not because the will requires it, not as a convenience or a settlement or an arrangement of any kind. I am asking because the house is considerably better when you are in it, and because the arguments are better, and because I have walked past the library 3 times this week, and each time I have thought of something I wish to tell you, and—" He stopped. I gathered from the silence that he was not a man who found the middle of such sentences easy to navigate. "And," she said, her voice was different now. The steadied quality was still there, but underneath it was something warmer. "And I would like," he said more quietly, "to have the occasion to tell you, for considerably more than 1 year." I heard her breathe. "The adjacent chair," she said after a moment. Her voice was very careful. "The adjacent chair," he confirmed. "Among other things. You once told me it was not a rank the furniture was entitled to hold." "I was mistaken about the furniture," he said. "I have been mistaken about a number of things this year. I find I would like the opportunity to be mistaken about further things with you in proximity to correct me. I am told by Mrs. Oakes, who emerged from the kitchen at approximately this point and saw them in the corridor, that she looked at him for a long time without speaking. That she did not cry, being the sort of woman who does not. That she said, eventually, with the precision that was entirely characteristic of her, "You should have said something sooner, Your Grace." And he said, "I know. The drainage scheme is going to require my oversight through the spring, at the very least." And he said, and Mrs. Oakes reported this with some pleasure, and told it again at Christmas to every member of the senior household who had not already heard it, "I am aware." I emerged from the foot of the stair only after they had retreated together toward the library, and the corridor was empty, and the first gray light was beginning to come in through the east windows. I stood there for a moment and thought about a document of 7 pages that I had understood completely when I drew it up, and not at all. The arrangement was not its purpose. It was merely the mechanism that brought 2 careful, sealed, proud people into the same house for long enough that they could not maintain the considerable effort of not knowing each other. I revised my understanding. She did not take the hired coach. The trunks, brought downstairs that morning by the footman, were carried back upstairs the following day. The books were unpacked. The sitting room in the east wing was once again occupied by someone who had stopped looking at it like a room she was leaving. I was present for the wedding in December, small by design, conducted at the church in the village rather than the cathedral in town, because she preferred it that way, and he, on this particular matter, was content to prefer what she preferred. I stood beside Everard in the front pew and was conscious of a feeling I have not had occasion to name precisely until now. It was not surprise. It was not satisfaction, quite. It was the feeling one has when a thing that was always going to happen has finally happened, and the world settles quietly back into the shape it was always meant to hold. He said her name once in the ceremony, in the same way he had said it in the corridor at 5 in the morning, without embellishment, entirely meant. She looked at him as though she knew exactly what it cost him to say anything at all, and had already decided some months ago that it was enough. That was sufficient for both of them. I have been a solicitor for 31 years. I have drawn up a great many documents in that time, and I have learned, slowly, imperfectly, to read the distance between what a document says and what it does. A will is a set of instructions. A settlement is a balance of terms. But sometimes what sits inside the language is not what the language intended, and the most precise instrument produces the most unexpected result. 7 pages, signed and witnessed on a gray October morning. The result was this. A woman who did not expect to be welcomed became indispensable. A man who did not expect to be reached found that he had been reached, quietly, entirely, without ceremony or performance, in a library on a gray northern coast with the fire going and the adjacent chair occupied by someone who had moved there without fuss and stayed. The drainage is very good now. The south wall roses are excellent. The estate runs as well as any in the county, and the county meeting minutes regularly contain proposals recognized by those present as particularly sound, their true origin being a matter of polite discretion rather than public record. The adjacent chairs in the library are still occupied. I drew the document up. I am glad. I would do it again.